everyone, my name is Elise Susko and I am a Literature and Language Master's student at Marymount University. Today I will be speaking about a research paper entitled Tragic No Longer, Chestnut Reclaims the Mulatta Tradition. After the abolition of slavery, people could no longer ignore the results of miscegenation. A new race, a mixed race, emerged, challenging the societal idea of a stringent racial binary. The mulatta physically embodies miscegenation, and as such, her existence highlights the sexual weakness of men, particularly white men, making her a controversial figure. Her ability to defy the supposed existence of a natural racial hierarchy makes her a threat. As a result, literary representations of the mulatta become a figure of tragedy and helplessness in order to undermine her power, the ability to expose the falsity of racial hierarchy. The most common trope, the passing mulatta, which portrays her attempt to infiltrate white society by passing as a white woman, always ends with the mulatta's discovery by society and punishment for her transgression, either through madness, death, or both. One 19th century author, Charles Chesnutt, portrays the mulatta in a manner counter to this tradition. He often uses the mulatta character as a tool to expose the weakness of white males and to exploit the white fear regarding the breakdown of a racial hierarchy. However, he must do so by using a shadow or underlying narrative to spread his message about racial identity without alienating his white audience. In the mulatta tradition, the masculine gaze objectifies the mulatta, transforming her into a sexualized object. Chestnut's shadow narrative, however, gives the mulatta power over the white male by flipping the power of the gaze. The mulatta takes the gaze and manipulates it, taking advantage of the sexual weakness of the white male in particular. Chestnut's rendering of the mulatta transforms her role from a tragic figure to a dangerous one. In Chestnut's world, the mulatta moves from passive to subversive, using her ability to manipulate the sexual weakness of males to her advantage. Chestnut's first novel, Mandy, Oxendine, was never published during his lifetime. It was considered too shocking, partly because of the power that the main character, a mulatta woman, wields. Over a period of several years, Chestnut rewrote the idea of Mandy into The House Behind the Cedars, which publishers felt adhered more closely to the standards of the mulatta tradition and was less radical in terms of its exploration of racial relations in the American South. While both novels use the mulatta as a figure of power through different manners, scholars often read Mandy as more progressive. Yet a closer examination of the novels reveals the opposite. Rena from House Behind the Cedars becomes more subversive than Mandy. Thus, the mulatta, traditionally a tragic figure, becomes empowered. Through a fresh outlook, the mulatta emerges into the late 19th century as a figure of social change rather than tragedy. Mandy, a young mulatta woman, moves to a new town in order to pass as white. Her childhood sweetheart, a mulatto man named Lowry, returns from college and tries to marry her. Mandy wants nothing to do with him. She aims to marry a white man named Utley to cement her place within the white community. Utley is a wealthy white man, but unbeknownst to Mandy, he is a lecher. Utley has intentions of using Mandy sexually and then dumping her to marry his wealthy fiancé, who will pay off his rather large acquired debts. The elder Gadsden also falls in love with her as the novel progresses. After first witnessing Mandy in church, he begins to idealize her as the perfect example of female beauty. Later in the novel, when Utley attempts to convince Mandy to assert her love through sex, she refuses his advances. He then attempts to rape her. A mysterious figure then appears from the shadows and kills the villainous Utley. Mandy, the last person seen with Utley, is thrown in jail for the murder, at which point the innocent Lowry confesses in order to save her. The townspeople are about to lynch Lowry for murdering a white man when the elder Gadsden, the true perpetrator of the crime, confesses. At this point, the community determines that Mandy and Lowry are both mulattoes and they are free to go. Gadsden is jailed for several years. Mandy is created and sustained throughout the novel through the sexualized male gaze. She enters the novel through this gaze as Lowry subtly refers to her as an object that he wishes to possess. Like Lowry, the wealthy white womanizer Utley also views Mandy as an object, but in a much more sinister manner. He wishes to use Mandy sexually, knowing that he can never marry her. He views her only as a sexual object to be used for his own needs. The elder Gadsden, a visiting pastor, also sexualizes Mandy through his white gaze. Like the others, his sexual desire for Mandy gradually begins to control him. The more Gadsden idealizes Mandy, the more power she has over him. He begins to challenge his own moral code in order to have Mandy in his possession. Later, he, like Utley and Lowry, begs Mandy to be his. Mandy's sexuality drives both white men into actions that, in Utley and Elder Gadsden's case, deeply affect their lives. Utley through his murder and Gadsden through imprisonment. And she does this by exploiting their sexual weaknesses. While each of these men turns Mandy into a sexual object, she in turn exploits their sexual weakness for her own gain. Mandy appears in this novel to illustrate the sexual weakness of the white male. In the end, each of the men who objectifies Mandy receives punishment for his actions, whereas Mandy walks away free to decide her own fate. The fact that she remains unpunished would have been quite controversial in Chestnut's day. She doesn't fall prey to the tragic mulatto tradition, and she represents an open criticism against the sexualization of African American women by white males. Yet in spite of Mandy's failure to embrace the role of tragedy, she accomplishes nothing in terms of changing racial divisions, making her less subversive than critics suggest she outwardly appears. Next, we will discuss the novel The House Behind the Cedars. Though similar in terms of content to Mandy Oxendine, in that the main character is a beautiful young mulatto woman, this story has a much more melodramatic plot. Many of the characters are also similar to that of Mandy Oxendine, but have been rewritten with more depth and complexity. Rena is persuaded by her brother to move away with him and pass as white. During this period, she meets a wealthy white man named George Tryon. She and George fall in love, and she becomes engaged to Tryon. He idealizes her as the paragon of femininity and beauty. Days before their wedding, Rena returns home to care for her sick mother. Tryon coincidentally returns to the same town at the same time, totally unaware of her presence. As he travels about town with the doctor, who is incidentally caring for Rena's mother, the doctor points out a beautiful mulatto girl and encourages him to gaze upon her through the window. Tryon sees the girl and recognizes her as Rena, realizing her true lineage in that moment. He cancels the engagement and returns home, humiliated for breaking one of the cardinal rules of his upbringing, falling in love with a non-white woman. Rena returns home heartbroken. She plans to teach at a local school for black children run by the lecherous Jeffrey Wayne. Wayne attempts to woo her, at which point Rena becomes horrified at his intentions. She feels certain that if she's caught alone with him, he will attempt to rape her. During this time, Tryon has a change of heart and attempts to find Rena and reconcile. He wishes to marry her despite her lineage. Rena encounters both Tryon and Wayne coming toward her on a separate path. Tryon looking hopeful to reunite with her, and Wayne looking evilly mischievous. Rather than face the gaze of either man, Rena runs into the woods to avoid them both. A storm breaks out and she becomes lost, contracting a nasty fever that leads to madness and eventually death. Mulatta protagonist Rena makes her first appearance via the male gaze, in this case her elder brother Warwick. Through his gaze, Rena becomes an object of sex and beauty before she can truly enter the novel. He also creates her as a white woman, for it is his idea that Rena should pass. Once he decides this, the other characters Rena encounters view her as white rather than black or mulatta. The masculine gaze later shifts from Warwick to Rena's fiancé, George Tryon. Once George sets his gaze upon Rena, she becomes the embodiment of ideal femininity and beauty. He literally crowns Rena as the queen of love and beauty at the Renaissance fair where he meets her. Dr. Green's gaze also sexualizes Rena and redefines her as a mulatto once again. He describes Rena in highly sexualized language and forces Tryon to view her sexualized body as if it were on display. Dr. Green's gaze then alters Tryon's, forcing him to see Rena as a mulatta. This transformation takes place in Tryon's mind, where his mental image of Rena's form changes her from a beautiful white woman into a terrifying, monstrous hag. After the change in Tryon's gaze, Rena embraces her mulatta identity as a result of the changes in the reflected gaze of her lover. After this incident, no one refers to Rena as white ever again. She is always the mulatta or Negro girl. The villainous lecher Jeff Wayne's gaze, like the other men in her world, also turns Rena into a sexualized object. It becomes clear that Wayne views her as a sexual object based on his thoughts, which we are privy to thanks to an omniscient narrator, and his attempts to subdue and rape Rena and get her alone. This pursuit terrifies Rena further when she discovers that Wayne has a living wife who fled from him because of his cruel and blasphemous ways. Clearly, the gaze of these men defines how the outside world and Rena herself identifies racially, as well as reducing Rena to a mere sexual object. Rena follows the mulatto tradition more closely than Mandy in that she feels guilt over passing, which is common to the trope. She also undergoes a melodramatic plot sequence that will lead to her ultimate death, probably the main conformity of this novel to the mulatto tradition. However, like Mandy, she also flips the male gaze to her advantage, which Chestnut portrays via the shadow narrative, making her appear on the surface to follow the mulatto tradition when in fact she revolutionizes it. Despite Rena's death at the end of the novel, her story leads to a higher purpose. While on the surface, Rena appears to go through the traditional tragic mulatto trope, underneath in the shadow narrative, through manipulating Tryon's gaze, something radical occurs. Chestnut's focus lies not upon Rena, but upon Tryon. The change that occurs in Tryon is significant, not Rena's fate. In The House Behind the Cedars, Chestnut succeeds in changing the ideology of white privilege / racial hierarchy through Tryon, the archetypal southern white male. Tryon makes a conscious decision to reject the racial truths ingrained in him throughout his life. Rena influences a real change in one man, symbolic of the mulatto's power to change racial ideology on a grander scale, which Chestnut often spoke of in his essays and addresses. Chestnut thus reclaims the tragic mulatta, making her a figure of power and social change, subverting the tragic mulatta trope in a subtle and yet effective way. Because Rena affects real change, whereas Mandy continues to live within the social norms and boundaries of a traditional mulatta, The House Behind the Cedars is far more controversial than Mandy Oxendine. However, it manages to keep the controversy hidden within the shadow narrative, fooling many white audiences and literary scholars alike. Thank you.